I don't think these are the right ones, but that's okay. Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ann Kennedy, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Tales of Cape Cod. I wanted to mention tonight that our little hidden gem is available for rentals. We have had weddings here, community meetings, League of Women Voter events, wakes, Thanksgiving and Christmas parties, and more. If you're interested in having your function here, please check out our website, www.talesofcapecod.org, for more information. Next week, we're going to have Michael Tugias as our guest speaker, co-writer of The Finest Hour, which was eventually made into a movie. Mr. Tugias has been our guest many times. Next week, he will talk about the Tales of Extreme Survival, which chronicles over 60 harrowing stories of courage, obstinance, and endurance, featuring more than a few Cape Cod residents. We are closed for Labor Day, and then we will have a special Thursday program on September 7th featuring Park Ranger Samantha Gray, who will talk about the history of the Cape Cod canal bridges. So while we're having discussions about when and how much to replace the Cape Cod bridges that we have now, the story of their beginning will be both timely and interestingly informative. So tonight's program, Two Unlikely Travelers, is sponsored by John and Eliza Lewis. I don't know if they're here tonight, but thank you. So we are pleased to welcome tonight an old friend. Not very old, but a friend. Tim Lindberg has been a member of Tales of Cape Cod for several years, and he has been one of our most favorite speakers on numerous occasions. Tim is a summer resident of Barnstable Village and a native of Boston, but spends his winters in London, which you will soon detect when he speaks. He's lived there almost 50 years. In London, he is a member of the Hecklut Society, which preserves and publishes primary documentation of the great age of exploration. Tim's particular interest is in the early transatlantic crossings. And I'm so very pleased to have Tim with us again. Last year, I couldn't talk him into it. This year, I was able to talk him into it. So thank you very much for coming back, Tim and Tim Lindberg.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming by. And thank you, Anne, for the kind introduction. My name is Tim Lindberg, and I am a resident of Barnstable Village. And although I've lived in London for many years, I always come back to Cape Cod for the summer. I just really prefer the ones that are not quite so wet. But I'll take what I can get in terms of weather. As Anne says, I've always been fascinated by the great age of exploration. That time when there were voyages of discovery, when people in Europe didn't know the contours of the continents, and people would go on long voyages just to risk their lives to find something someone hadn't seen before. I'm very fortunate in my retirement to be actively involved in the Hecklut Society in London, which is basically one of these old British historical societies. And what we do is, in fact, we research and we publish primary documentation having to do with some of the earliest voyages. And I've learned a lot with them. When you add that with my interest in Cape Cod and its maritime history, well, there's just a lot of stories to tell. And I think it's hard with COVID, but it was pre-COVID, several years ago, I gave a talk on some of the earliest voyages and explorers to Cape Cod and New England. And I tried to make the point that, obviously, if you think the Pilgrims were the first Europeans first English, to cross the channel, to cross the Atlantic, and to come to these shores, well, you'd be sorely wrong. In the 100 years before the Pilgrims landed, there were probably some 10, 20,000 transatlantic voyages. And let's see if I can do it. There were 500 ships a year that would come to these waters by the time the Pilgrims got here. There were actually ports in Newfoundland and what have you that were crowded at certain times of the year. There were 10,000 Englishmen employed in the fishing industry on and off the coast of North America. I like to tell the story that in September 1620, when the Mayflower was docked at Plymouth, England, getting to make its seminal voyage across the Atlantic, there were 70 ships at anchor. 50 of them had just returned from North America. So now, of these voyages, most of them were private, for-profit, undocumented voyages. And most of them, quite frankly, were inconsequential in terms of history. But tonight, I want to talk about one particular set of voyages, which happened just before the Pilgrims arrived, and was very consequential in terms of the history that was to follow. It happened just before the Pilgrims arrived, and it's very much a tale of Cape Cod, because much of it happened right here on Cape Cod. Now, when I first started researching this, I was kind of confused, I was kind of surprised to find out that famous authors and historians would tell a slightly different story in terms of what happened, not only in a matter of opinion, but in a matter of fact, small and large. And as we all know, if there's a tale and it's 400 years old, it gets told, it gets retold, it gets lengthened, shortened, mythologized, and what have you. And then, God help us, Disney gets a hold of it, does a whole mashup of history and confuses a generation of children. But authors also tend to quote previous authors 100 years ago, who quote previous authors of 100 years ago. And what you find is that matters of opinion sometimes get translated in terms of matters of fact. So I said, forget it. I'm going to go back to the original documentation of all these voyages. I'm going to look at the ship's logs. I'm going to look at the true remembrances of the eyewitnesses and any other documentation that there's nothing before it, and then find out for myself what happened, when it happened, and maybe find out a little bit about why it happened. So this is a story at the end of the day about two men. And although they were born about the same time, and they were born in towns that came to have the same name, Plymouth, they died about the same time, unceremoniously, and we still don't know where they're buried. Yet they were an ocean apart, not only in terms of distance, but in terms of culture. They were truly two unlikely travel companions. But yet, through serendipity, they came together, and the two of them basically changed the course of history in their own way. This is, of course, the story of Captain Thomas Dermer and Tisquantim, or as we know him, Squanto. Now, you could be forgiven if you don't know anything about Thomas Dermer, because you can go to Plymouth, Patuxet, or you can go to the Pilgrim Hall Museum, and you'll never hear his name. But surely you know something about Squanto. Every school child reads about it in his books, and as a youngster. But in truth, the story of Squanto is kind of a recent construct. If you read the history of the Pilgrims before they were even called the Pilgrims, he hardly gets a mention. He's a footnote. It was only after Abraham Lincoln made Thanksgiving a national holiday, and the myth of the first Thanksgiving sort of took off, that Squanto became a character that was more in the imagination of people, and the mythology began. But tonight we don't want to talk about the relationship between Squanto and the Pilgrims. I want to talk about what happened to Squanto before he met the Pilgrims. Who was Thomas Dermer? Where did he go? How did he learn English? How did all that work? So bear with me and let me tell you a story. Unfortunately, starting off, we don't know when Squanto or Thomas Dermer were actually born. There's no way of knowing that. So even though I said I was going to tell you everything that was true tonight, I'm going to start out and use presenter's license and make up a birthday for them. And I'm going to say that they were born on the 8th of August, 1588, which I understand in Chinese culture is a very fortunate number, 8888. But for the Spanish, it wasn't quite so fortunate, because that was the date of the Battle of Gravelines. That was the date that the British defeated the Spanish Armada. And I say this date, and it's not a date that's seared into the memory of many Americans, perhaps, but if the English hadn't won this, the train of history would have taken a very different set of tracks. Back then, Philip II in Spain was the most powerful, the wealthiest monarch in Europe, and he was a good Catholic king, and he wanted to bring England back into the Catholic fold. And basically, so he asked to marry Elizabeth I, as he had been married to her half-sister, the previous Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. But she said no. And so he did the most reasonable thing he could think of, is he planned to kill her. And if he couldn't kill her, he was going to depose her. So it all came to a head in the summer of 1588. And as the English like to say, with the benefit of good Protestant wind, the Spanish were defeated. And two things changed for Thomas and Tisquantim in their life in the future. One, England now ruled the waves. And as England ruled the waves, and would continue to do so for the next 300 years, they could project their power anywhere they wanted. And secondly, it dawned on them that everybody else had been much more active in the New World than them, and they resolved themselves to do something about it. But to perfect their claim to land in North America, they knew they needed, as we say, boots on the ground. They needed colonies. They needed forts. They needed plantations. In effect, the English were coming. It was just a matter of time. Yeah, okay. So Thomas Dermer, and there is no actual picture for Thomas Dermer, so I'm using an avatar here as best I can. It's the way I picture him anyway. But the first thing we can say about him is, well, he wasn't English. Dermer's not an English name. He was probably German or Flemish, and they had emigrated into Plymouth, England. And this is not uncommon in that time. There was such religious strife that it wasn't uncommon for groups of people to pick up sticks from one country and move to another. You had the Walloons, you had the Huguenots. The Pilgrims had to move to the Netherlands to practice their brand of separatism before they came to the States. And so his parents were probably merchants in Plymouth, but of no great note. But Thomas Dermer basically had greater designs in life. He wanted to get ahead. This was basically a time of medieval Europe, and you were your father's son. If your father was a carpenter, you were going to be a carpenter. If your father was a farmer, well, you were going to be tethered to the land for the rest of your life. But things were changing. And the person who exemplified that most for a guy like Thomas Dermer was this guy, Sir Francis Drake, also born in Plymouth, very nearby, to a poor farming family, 12 children. He went on to be one of the richest men in England, a national hero. He basically had the ear of the Queen. He was the role model for people who want to get ahead in life. And Thomas Dermer took that route as well. He wanted to become a captain. Well, there's two ways to get it. I mean, when you think about it, in 1865, Horace Greeley told young Americans who wanted to get ahead, "Go west, young man." At the turn of the century, people like Richard Hakluyt in England would have told youngsters, "Go to sea, young man." Because if you went to sea, you could get a share of the profits of the ship. You could advance your station in life. And clearly that's what Thomas Dermer wanted to do. He was good at it, and he made captain by the time he was in his mid-20s. You could either rock up at the dock as a 12 or 14-year-old boy and sign on for service for what would be a very hard life, but maybe not as hard as the one that you would otherwise have had. Or you could pay a ship's master to basically go and become an apprentice and hopefully become a captain in time. And that's probably what Thomas Dermer did. He also must have done very well. And Plymouth at that time was a rather small town, some 5,000 people. And he came to the attention of this man, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, also from Plymouth. Sir Ferdinando was a story in and of himself, but he was related to the Queen by marriage. He knew all the great ship captains and merchants at the time. He was not only a good guy to know, he was the guy to know. And Dermer entered his good graces. To give you an idea of how important it was, he was appointed by Queen Elizabeth herself to be governor of the fort of Plymouth. And we think of Plymouth as being, these days, as a nice seaside town in the south of England, but not back then. Plymouth is in the very southwest corner of England, and it basically was guarding the entrance to the English Channel. The person who was the governor of the fort of Plymouth was more than just a governor. He was basically the power broker in the west of England. And to know him was a good thing for you, and he'll be part of our story. The fort of Plymouth itself, as you can see, the port of Plymouth was a fort with a little port attached to it. Let me do this. So Dermer also knew that with the change of the guard in the palace, he had to get acquainted with the new power brokers. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and James I took on after that. And so by the time Dermer got to be a captain, there were new power brokers at play. So he was very good at ingratiating himself with the new court of St. James. In particular, there's one gentleman by the name of John Mason, who was basically one of King James's the first favorite. He would do various favors for him. If there was a Scottish rebellion, he was a sea captain, so he would go up and quell the rebellion. And perhaps Thomas Dermer was involved in some of those expeditions up north. He will become part of our story later on as well. Meanwhile, back in Patuxet, Tisquantim was growing up. And I can tell you, you can read a lot about what Squanto's life was when he was a child and what he did and what have you. But from my own research, a lot of that's just mythology and assumptions. We don't really know what his life was like at all. But we do know from current accounts at the time what it was like to be a young man as a Wampanoag. And in particular, there's a Dutch trader by the name of Isaac de Razier, who wrote at length about what life was like growing up as a young Wampanoag. And just tell one little story. When they came of age, they would take them and lead them out into the woods and leave them in the woods. And they would be left by themselves to fend for themselves, to find food, shelter, and protection. When they finally took them back out of the woods, they would feed them a cocktail, a broth of poisonous herbs and what have you, which would make them violently ill. But if they survived all that, then they would be allowed, if they survived it well, then they would be allowed to take a wife and they'd be allowed to take their place in society. The point is, Tisquantim, he was taught to survive. And one thing you'll find from the story is, if nothing else, he was a survivor. We also know something about Patuxet. If you think the Pilgrims were the first Europeans to pull into the harbor of Plymouth, as it is now, well, you'd be wrong. And most notably, in 1605, famously, Champlain moved in himself, the famous Champlain. His captain, when he pulled into to visit Plymouth Harbor, immediately ran aground in a sandbar and had to wait quite some time for the tide to take him out, which gave Champlain plenty of time to get out and write this and draw this map. And he talked quite a bit about what his experience was in what he called Port Saint Louis. And the interesting thing is that it was crowded. There were 2,000 people living in Patuxet at the time. All the fields around the harbor were planted with corn. Champlain said there were huts everywhere, or witus. And there was plenty of abundance of food. There were many canoes out catching cod coming back. He was greeted by 18 to 20 young men at the shore. And you kind of wonder if maybe Tisquantim might have been one of them as a young teenager. But it was a very healthy existence for people living in Patuxet. At that time as well, if you were in the hills above Plymouth and you were looking out over Cape Cod Bay, it wouldn't be uncommon at all to see European ships sail by. Of the 500 ships that came fishing and trading in North America at that time, maybe 100 came to Cape Cod Bay. By 1610, every summer, ships from Jamestown in Virginia would come up to Cape Cod Bay to catch fish to feed the colonists in Jamestown. So they didn't even all come from Europe. Now, most of those ships would have very little interaction with the Native Americans that were there at the time, but that was about to change. So here I want to just mention one thing that I sort of found out. When people talk about voyages back then, they say that what drove them was gold, glory, and God. But from my reading, I think it was really gold, gold, and gold. Don't underestimate how much the English were jealous of the Spanish and all the gold that they were taking out of their colonies. And that was seared in their memory. And the thought of El Dorado and the potential of maybe just finding some place that was full of gold was just tantalizingly close for them. And what happened is about that time, in the early 1600s, the merchant class was growing in England. People were making money. They were saving money. There was capital available. And every town would have its own society of merchants. They called themselves the Society of Merchant Adventurers of Leeds or the Society of Merchant Adventurers of Bristol. And these guys were really not shopkeepers who liked to go on exotic voyages and have adventures. Adventure to them meant to risk something for an uncertain return. And we use the word today as well, but we drop the AD and we just call it venture. So think of them as venture capitalists of the time. Not only were they venture capitalists, but in England there's a show called Dragon's Den. And here I think we call it Shark Tank. They were kind of like a Shark Tank. If you had an idea and you needed some capital to do something, you'd go to the local Society of Merchant Adventurers. You'd tell them what your idea was. If they liked it, they'd back you and take most of the profit. But that was presenting all sorts of opportunities in the new Stuart regime. But at the end of the day, it was gold that ruled. Nothing got the merchant adventurers more excited about life. Nothing got their blood pressure going too high than the thought of something in return for gold. So Sir Ferdinando Gorges was one such merchant adventurer. Now you might say, well, he was a government official. He was running Plymouth. He was governor of the fort. That's true. But he used his position as governor. If he could do something and find something that would give him a little profit and use his influence to line his own pocket, he wasn't adverse to that. So some things never change. And in that regard, he was one of the original investors in what they called the Northern Virginia Company. The Northern Virginia Company was given to Sir Ferdinando Gorges. There was a Southern Virginia Company, which established, for example, Jamestown. But the Northern Virginia Company hadn't done anything in the 4 years it had its charter. And the merchant adventurers wanted a little return on their adventure. So it was time for Sir Ferdinando to do something about that. So famously in 1611, he set the wheels in motion to basically start a plantation, start a colony in Northern Virginia, as it was known at the time. So you may know the story. There was a Captain Harlow that he hired in 1611. And his job was to go to northern Virginia and do what they all did. They were going to go and capture some Native Americans, bring them back, Christianize them, teach them English, and then bring them back to Northern Virginia to help the English steal their land. And it was a kind of interesting construct, but that's the way they thought. And that's what he did. In 1611, Harlow went over and he took 2 from Maine, 1 from Nantucket, and 2 from Martha's Vineyard. And you know one of the ones from Martha's Vineyard is the famous Epinow. The story of Epinow has been told so many times, I won't repeat it too much, but he's important for our story later on. So Epinow was a big man. He was a strong man. He was a smart man. And he lived with Sir Ferdinando, probably in Bristol, England, for the better part of 3 years. And during that time, he learned a little bit of English. And he learned enough to know that, look, the only thing these guys care about is gold. So I'm going to tell them that in the middle of my island, Martha's Vineyard, or what the English at the time called Capewag, there's a gold mine. And if you take me back there, I'll show you where the gold is. Now, it's an obvious ruse, but when you're greedy and you're gullible, well, you'll buy it. Now, Sir Ferdinando probably tried to keep it secret, but you can't keep something like that secret. So the word got out that there's gold and islands about Cape Cod. Something else happened about that time in 1611. This dashing man, Marmaduke Royden, had the good fortune of marrying this woman, Elizabeth Thurgood, and she was rich. She came with a dowry of about £10,000. And Marmaduke wanted to immediately join the Society of Merchant Adventurers. He wanted to double down. He wanted to take the money that he just got, and he wanted to double it if he could. And he let it be known that he was looking for adventures, some way to invest his money. And according to John Smith of Pocahontas and Jamestown fame, he said that there was this rather unscrupulous captain by the name of Thomas Hunt. And he basically knew about the gold in and about Cape Cod, and he told Marmaduke about it. Marmaduke was very interested in it. This is good. I'm in. I'll get some other merchant adventurers with me. Okay. But he also hired John Smith because he was a safe pair of hands, and he'd been more experienced. So in 1614, a voyage set out, financed by Marmaduke Rowden, of John Smith and Thomas Hunt. And their explicit instructions was not to sort of set up a colony, but to go search for mines of gold. And if they couldn't get gold, catch some whales. If you can't get the whales, then at least come back with a lot of codfish and pay my expenses and bring the ship back. And that was the instructions they had. And off they sailed in March 1614, and they met at Monhegan Island. I'd just like to show you where Monhegan Island is. Monhegan's off the coast of Maine, and for many, many years, this is where the English would come together, where they'd have a rendezvous point. It was safe, it was off the coast, there was a leeward protection from storms, and so, we'll be mentioning this place quite a bit. I just want to mention that first. So, both Smith and Hunt met there, and Smith was the master of the voyage, and so he basically decided who does what. And he said, Thomas, you go and find as many whales as you can. If you can't find any whales, then load it up with a lot of codfish and take it down to Spain and sell it. And John Smith, in a smaller boat with a few men, sailed down the coast to do just some reconnaissance work, really. And he made this famous map of 1614, which is actually a very accurate map when you consider it against what it looks like today. But his idea was he was going to go for mines of gold, and Thomas was going to go for the fish. Now, John Smith in his memoirs wrote that I never really thought there was any gold there anyway, but it really doesn't matter because it's a great way to get money out of merchant adventurers. He was, if nothing else, honest on that kind. But he came all the way down the coast of New England, and he was the one that named it New England, and he came around our Cape Cod, he came around the backside, and he got down to Chatham, and he stopped. And this is what he said about that trip. He regretted not being able to get to Capawack, to Martha's Vineyard, with its abundance of corn, copper, and minerals, i.e. gold. And he went, and he was told to go and discover it, but he miscarried along the way, and basically, he hopes to get back someday. He was planning a second voyage. John Smith went back to Monhegan Island, and he went back to London, but it didn't end there, because as you know, Thomas Hunt, who basically may have been somewhat of an unsavory character, decided maybe he was a little bit piqued. He said, John Smith was able to go for gold, and I have to catch fish. I'm going to line my pockets a little bit and make a little extra money. And as you know, he came down the coast, and he captured 20 Wampanoags from Patuxet, and another 4 or 7, depending what account you read, from perhaps right here in Camaquid. And famously, we don't know who the names, what the names of 26 of them are, but the 27th was Tisquantim. Yeah. And at the same time that year, Epinal, who had been with Sir Ferdinando for 3 years, Sir Ferdinando tried to cash in his check. He sent another voyage under Captain Hobson in 1614, slightly after the John Smith voyage. And famously, Epinal had always planned to escape. And so he arranged with his fellow Wampanoags, who came out with some 20 canoes, and with a rain of arrows, he jumped off the ship, as you know, and he escaped. But Hobson went back to Sir Ferdinando, and he told him 2 things. He told him that Epinal was dead, and he told them that there's still gold on the island. I didn't get a chance to look. But anyway, those are the events that happened leading up to Tisquantim being captured and sent to slavery in Spain. And so, before I talk about what happened next, I just want to say a few words about what the nature of slavery in Spain was at that time. It is kind of complicated. As you know, the English had no problem capturing Native Americans and Christianizing them and teaching them English if it was for the purpose of establishing a colony. They took a dim view of slavery at that point in time. They were to perfect it in another 100 years. But the Spanish were different. The Spanish had no problems going to northern Africa or sub-Saharan Africa and capturing people and selling them into slavery into the Americas. They had no problem in America of basically enslaving Native Americans under what they call the encomienda system. As long as you Christianize them, as long as you feed them and clothe them, then it's okay if you force them to work for you. It was a fig leaf for slavery. But it was illegal to take Native Americans from North America and sell them into Spain. It was probably more of an economic reason than a moral reason. They wanted the labor to stay in the Americas and not to leak out into Europe. But anyway, such were the laws. It was illegal to sell Native Americans into Spain. But that didn't help Tisquantim yet. So Tisquantim made his first voyage, his first transatlantic voyage from Cape Cod to Malaga, probably sometime in late 1614. And it would have been a grueling trip. It was a 2-month trip. We know that there were probably more Wampanoags on that ship than there were men sailing it, so they probably were held in chains below the deck. But when he finally got to Malaga, it must have been like going to another world. Remember, Malaga, Spain, had just released itself from 800 years of Moorish rule. It was a very exotic place at the time. As you come into the port of Malaga at the time, you would have seen the Alcazaba Palace, which was already hundreds of years old and is still there today. I would be surprised if Tisquantim didn't see that. Now, there were various markets for selling slaves, and of course he couldn't do it in an appropriate market, but there were black markets where he could try to do so. But we know from Bradford that the friars of those parts heard about the sale, and probably because it was illegal, they stopped it. Not all of it, but they redeemed the remaining Wampanoags, and they took them into their priory, which was probably this place here. It was established in 1585, and is the priory of the friars, and it still exists in part today. Now, all we know about what happened then was that Tisquantim miraculously got away, according to Bradford, to England, and he stayed with a merchant by the name of John Slaney in a place called Cornhill in London. But how that happened, historians have always wondered how that happened. And think about it. You're a penniless ex-slave. You're a Wampanoag from North America. You've got no one to talk to. You've got no means. How do you just get away and end up staying with a wealthy merchant in London? Now, I don't want to belittle his situation or make fun of it, but it seems to me that's about as likely as an Afghan or Syrian refugee just suddenly getting away and ending up in Seattle and moving with Bill Gates. So it's not going to happen. It couldn't have happened that way. There are a lot of complicated potential, and it's always potential, ways that could have happened. But it's probably most likely the simplest one is true. So here, I'd like to just sort of make a little digression and ask you a question, and we'll come back to it later. If I asked you what was the first permanent English settlement in North America, well, you'd probably say, well, that was Jamestown in 1607. If I asked you what was the second permanent English settlement in North America, you would say Plymouth. And you would, but you'd be wrong. And the reason you'd be wrong is you're not Canadian. It was actually in Newfoundland in 1610. King James allowed for merchant adventurers to establish colonies in certain areas. We had the Southern Virginia crowd, and the Northern Virginia crowd, and above that was the Newfoundland Company. And in 1610, some merchants from Bristol started the first colony in Newfoundland. There were plenty of fishermen up in Newfoundland, but no one had actually established an official colony as yet. So the people that established the colony went to the Dragon's Den, the Shark Tank in London. They got the money from the merchant adventurers, and they started this colony. And we have the actual instructions from those merchant adventurers in terms of what they were expected to do, how they expected to get a return for their adventure. And one of the specific requirements of that colony was, and you'll guess this, go out and capture some Native Americans, Christianize them, teach them English, and make them make us money. The problem with that is, for the first 3 years at the colony, they didn't even meet any Native Americans. The people that lived in Newfoundland at the time were the Beothuk people. And the Beothuk people are totally different from the Algonquins further south. The Beothuk people had 100 years' experience of dealing with Europeans, generations of experience. And they knew pretty damn well it wasn't a good idea to mess with them at all. It never went their way. Fishermen don't have a moral compunction to treat Native Americans well. They just shot them. And so the Beothuk people were forced to retreat inland, and they would not come close to any Europeans. I actually want to say that the story of the Beothuk people is a very sad one, because they died out in total about 200 years ago. But not only that, they know when they died out exactly. They know the year they died out. In a macabre sort of point of fact of history, they actually knew who the last Beothuk person was. Her name was Shanadidit. In the early 19th century, her family was shot, and she was taken by the English to be a housemaid for a wealthy merchant. And when she died, they never found another Beothuk. But that's another story. In Cupid's Cove, things weren't going very well. But guess who the person was who basically was the big merchant adventurer backing that colony? It was none other than John Slaney. So John Slaney, we know a lot about John Slaney. I know too much about John Slaney. He was very famous at the time. And he had a brother, Humphrey Slaney. Together they were the Slaney brothers. And they were the ones that made sort of the aggressive sort of investments. Humphrey was more aggressive than his brother John. Humphrey was doing a lot of business in Spain. Humphrey was doing so much business in Spain that he had his own agent living in Spain, his son. So the son of Humphrey Slaney, an investor in the Newfoundland Company, nephew of John Slaney, was living in Spain. He certainly would have heard about this interloper, Thomas Hunt, trying to sell North Americans in Malaga, being taken by the friars. I think it's probably pretty likely that he went to those friars and he said, well, I promise that I'll bring them up in the Christian way. I promise that I'll bring them up Catholic, in fact. And here's a little gold. I'll take a few of them off your hands and send them to Uncle John in London. I can't prove that, but that is probably the most likely way which Tisquantim made his way to London. Oh, sorry. And so Tisquantim voyaged to London. Probably happened something in late 1614, 1615 or so. Now, the thing about John Slaney is I know a lot about him. And he did actually have a manor house in Cornhill in London. And I know exactly where that manor house was. So I went to see it. Excuse the photobomb, I couldn't help myself. But London in 1614 was medieval London. It was all wood and higgledy-piggledy buildings. And in 1666, you may know, the whole place burnt to the ground. So there's no way we will ever see the manor house of John Slaney. But it did exist. It's not a very good picture for you to see, but But the medieval London at the time would have been a fascinating place for Tisquantim to see. Could you imagine that? 100,000 people, bustling. It was crowded. There was a lot of disease. Rich people and poor people living cheek by jowl. You wonder if staying with John Slaney, Tisquantim was able to get out and see the sights and sounds of medieval London. And it's interesting, but there was someone else, a Native American, living in London at the same time as Squanto. You probably know who she is. Pocahontas. Pocahontas, or Mrs. John Rolfe, was in London with her husband and her son Thomas, because he was trying to sell and gin up his tobacco business. And people have speculated, hey, I wonder if Tisquantim, when he lived in London, if he met Pocahontas. And you know what? I looked into it. He might have. So I have a map for you. They were pretty close to each other. He could have just walked around the corner and seen her, if it were possible. And the times overlap. But I think, in fact, it didn't happen that way, because there's no record of it taking place. And at the end of the day, Pocahontas was the daughter of a king. She was vetted by society at the time she was there. She went to a masked ball with Queen Anne. So she probably ran in different circles. But having said that, sorry, I gotta go there. We don't know exactly how long Tisquantim spent in London, but according to John Smith, it was a good while. Other anecdotal evidence makes us think that he was a good 2 years to learn English there, and so it was probably some time in the early part of 1617 that he made his next transatlantic voyage for his intended purpose, to Newfoundland. And there, he might have just lived out the rest of his days. And if that happened, you never would have heard of Tisquantim. But it didn't turn out that way because other things were happening at the same time. Go back to John Smith. When John Smith finished his voyage in 1614, he didn't go back to Marmaduke and tell him about his voyage because he didn't find any gold. He went directly back to Plymouth, England, to see Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Because Sir Ferdinando was the one who had the power in the Northern Virginia Company to set up colonies. And at the end of the day, John Smith, that's what he wanted to do. He was on the outs with the Southern Virginia Company, and he wanted a northern colony to compete with Jamestown. And he wanted to prove that he was the guy, and he could do it. So he went directly to see Sir Ferdinando. He showed him his map. He told him all about the excellent harbors that he visited and the great places that would be fantastic to put a colony in. And Sir Ferdinando listened very intently, because this is what he wanted to hear. But then just a few weeks later, Captain Hobson came back, as you remember, with the bad news that Eppineu had escaped. He died, and he never got to see if there was gold in Capawack. And the failure of that, and the fact that yet again Sir Ferdinando had lost money, probably threw him into the arms of John Smith and said, okay, we're going to put together a voyage in 1615, and we're going to set up a colony in New England, newly named New England. He made John Smith Admiral of New England, and John Smith loved titles. And so it was. But Sir Ferdinando didn't totally trust John Smith, for good reason. And he needed a local boy, someone he could trust, someone who basically, it was a safe pair of hands to go with John Smith. So he chose Thomas Dermer. So in the spring of 1615, 2 ships set sail, one by John Smith, the other by Thomas Dermer, to go and rendezvous at Monhegan Island and then set up a colony in New England. And so you all know about that colony. You don't, because it didn't happen. Thomas Dermer made it to Monhegan, and he got there, and no John Smith. He waited for him. He probably loaded up with fish and went back to Plymouth. John Smith, well, he had the big, expensive ship. But 2 days out to sea, the mast broke. So he went back and got another ship. And then he was beset by pirates. He got away from those pirates. Then there were some more pirates, and something else happened, if you can believe John Smith's account of it. Anyway, at the end of the day, in 1615, John Smith ended back in England with a shirt on his back And poor Ferdinand de Gorges basically had nothing to show for the adventure other than the fish that Thomas Dermer brought back. But where do you think John Smith wanted to set up the next colony in New England? Where do you think he was going to go? He actually said in his memoirs that he was going to spend the first winter off of Maine and then head south to the intended place. Several places John Smith hinted very strongly about Capawack. And you can't prove it, but many people think that he intended to put a colony on Martha's Vineyard. But it didn't happen. So now here we are at the end of 1615. Tisquantum's learning English in London. Thomas Dermer's out of a job, and things weren't going well on the Avalon Peninsula. John Slaney was fed up with the poor returns from Cupid's Cove, so he fired the governor. He needed to get a new governor in. He needed to get a governor who was strong, who could deal with the pirates that were up there, who could deal with unruly fishermen. And so he chose someone also that was connected with the court of St. James. And so he chose John Mason, the friend of Thomas Dermer. And John Mason took the job from Slaney, and he brought Thomas Dermer up to Cupid's Cove with him. So sometime in 1616, Thomas Dermer made the trip up to Cupid's Cove. And we know he was there because in September of that year, he wrote a big pamphlet about all the great opportunities in economics of Newfoundland, the minerals and ways that merchant adventurers could make money there. But then, as fate would have it, in 1617, Tisquantum was once again on his second transatlantic voyage to Newfoundland. And that's the first time that Thomas met Tisquantum. And they were bound to be travel companions for the next 3 years. And so when you think about it, when you think about Squanto as being that friendly Native American who came out of the woods to help the Pilgrims survive, just remember, that wasn't his first rodeo. He had already done the same thing with another colony in Newfoundland for at least as long as he had spent with the Pilgrims. He knew the English, and he knew English colonies as well. So it didn't take very long for Dermer, spending time with Tisquantum, to realize it's not very useful up here. We never get to see any Beothic anyway. And if he did meet them, he couldn't speak to them anyway. So it wasn't much use as a translator. But Dermer was committed to helping his friend John Mason make a go of Cupid's Cove. So he stayed there for a few years. But eventually it became obvious that Squanto could be more useful down south. Squanto, for his part, realized that Thomas Dermer was well connected. And so, as Ferdinand de Gorges said, he drew his affections wholly to follow his hopes that way, i.e., Squanto teased Thomas Dermer to take him back to Patuxet. If you take me back, I'll help you there. And so Thomas Dermer wrote a letter to Sir Ferdinand de Gorges in 1618, explaining, I'm here in Newfoundland, and I've got a Native American from New England with me who's happy to help us. Well, Sir Ferdinand de Gorges took it hook, line, and sinker. This is exactly what he was looking for. And so he immediately sent another captain to Monhegan Island and said, wait there for Thomas Dermer and Tisquantum to come down and see you. But this guy's name was Rowcroft, and to make a long story short, he wasn't a very good manager. His men mutinied. He had to escape to Jamestown. His ship sank. He got in a fight with another colonist at Jamestown. He was shot to death. And so he wasn't very helpful to Thomas Dermer. But Thomas Dermer never got the message. So sometime in late 1618, he talked to John Mason, and he said, look, here's my idea. And John Mason, to his credit, said, look, you're very helpful to me here, but what you should do is just get on a ship, sail over to Plymouth, England, and see Sir Ferdinand de Gorges, and explain your situation to him. And that's what he did. Oh, no, not. And so Sorry, I messed up my slides. And so Tisquantim had his third transatlantic voyage from Newfoundland to Plymouth, England, where they saw Sir Ferdinand Gorges, explained the situation, and he said, "You've already written me a letter. I'm absolutely in, 100%. You don't even have to go to Merchant Adventures and get any money. I'll bank the whole thing. Take my ship as soon as you can and go back to Monhegan Island." But it was too late in that year for them to go back to Monhegan Island. So they spent the winter of 1618-19 with Sir Ferdinand Gorges someplace around Bristol. Now, I can't tell you exactly where Tisquantim spent that winter, but by tradition in the West Country, they think it was this place here, Birdcombe Manor, which still exists to this day. That wasn't Squanto's car. But I know it wasn't that. Sorry. But I can't tell you exactly it was. But this is tradition. And the funny thing about tradition is it lives on in the face of facts that are against it. It's funny because for the 400th anniversary of the English adventure in America, some aficionados in Bristol made this huge tapestry, kind of mimicking the Bayeux tapestry, made of panels. And what they did is they made one panel, which had, I have a little pointer here, so it had Sir Ferdinand Gorges and his wife, right below Birdcombe Manor, and there's Tisquantim, amusing Sir Ferdinando by trying on a suit of armor. Well, before you think that this is just a bunch of knitting nutters, this had the approval of the royal family. They even got Prince Charles, as he was at the time, to come back and add his stitch. They got the Queen to come down and add a stitch. They got the Queen Mum to come down and add a stitch. The Duke of Edinburgh added a stitch. They had a bus from Buckingham Palace coming down there to add stitches. Too bad that the date is wrong and it never happened. That's okay. That's tradition, not history. So in the spring of 1619, Tisquantim made his fourth transatlantic voyage from Plymouth to Monhegan Island with Thomas. And there, the story turns a little bit sad. First of all, Thomas got there, and there was no Rowcroft, so he didn't have all the supplies that he needed. But he just said, "I'm just going to press on anyway." And so they did. They left Monhegan Island, and they traveled down along the coast. And although they had heard there were issues, they had no idea what they were about to see. Because as you know, that was the time of the Great Dying. Between 1616 and 1619, there was a virgin soil epidemic for 3 years in a row. And between 70 and 90% of the Native Americans along the coast perished. We all know, we've lived through a little pandemic, it wasn't much of anything. But a virgin soil pandemic, a virgin soil epidemic, is something where people have no ability to fight it. It was probably just smallpox. But as they went along, Thomas Dermer said, "I found some ancient plantations, not long since populous, now utterly void." When people quote someone talking about the great dying, they're usually quoting Dermer, because Dermer is only one of 2 people who saw it with his own eyes and wrote about it. He also said that in other places a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. In other words, it wasn't over yet. In a kind of a matter-of-fact way, he said when he arrived at his savages' native country, finding all dead. So can you imagine that? I mean, I can't imagine that. Tisquantim, after all he's been through, slavery, going up to London, and then finagling his way back to Patuxet, only to find out everyone had perished. So Thomas understood the anguish that Tisquantim was feeling. So he agreed to walk inland a little bit, and that this would have been sometime around May 1619. And they went to a town called Namaskett, an area that we call today Middleborough. And they found some people that were still alive. And they sent word to the Pokanoket that there is someone who was captured back in 1614, and he's back with an Englishman. And here I have to say something about the relationship between the Wampanoags and the English and the French Europeans at that time. And it wasn't good. The Wampanoags remember very well the 27 men that was basically stolen and they assumed killed by the English. And just earlier that year, some ship had come into near the Pokanoket and they invited some Wampanoags on board. And they just slaughtered all of them using a medieval type of shotgun for no reason whatsoever. So they didn't take it lying down. Every time they had a chance, they took the revenge as they could. There was a shipwrecked French fishing vessel 2 years before in 1617, some places off of Truro. The men gathered all their belongings and got to shore, but one by one they were killed by the Nossets, saving 3 or 4 who they basically handed from sachem to sachem, treating them no better than they would treat their dogs, as they were told. And when Dermer sent messages, 2 kings came back, he said. And the 2 kings must have been the Massasoit, Usamiquin, and his brother Quatakina, and 50 armed men. It wasn't a welcoming committee. Oh, sorry, it's the shipwreck. And what Dermer said was in that meeting in Namaskut in Middleborough, he said they bore an inveterate hate of the English. And that Squanto cannot but deny they would have killed me if he hadn't interceded strongly on my behalf. Squanto saved Thomas's life. And what they said, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. But they conversed all day. And by the end of the day, Dermer said that they were well satisfied with what Squanto had told them. He explained the situation. And by the end of the day, relations were now true, i.e. normalized. And as a sign of goodwill, the Massasoit released one of the French fishermen, who must have been very happy to be released. And they got another one as they headed back toward Patuxet. But at that point in time, Thomas and Tisquantim sailed back to Monhegan Island, and Thomas put all his belongings on a ship that went down to Jamestown, because his objective was eventually to make it to Jamestown. But he understood that Squanto, after all he'd gone through, wouldn't want to spend another winter in Jamestown with Thomas. So he left him in Patuxet. And he actually went to a place, we think it's Setauket, which is now part of a place called East Bridgewater. And he spent the winter there. Meanwhile, Thomas Dermer took his small little 5-ton pinnace and made it all the way down along the coast. But he stopped somewhere on the way. Where do you think he stopped? Oh, I don't know. Capawack. He stopped at Martha's Vineyard. Why? Because he was explicitly told by Sir Ferdinand Gorges to stop there. Why? Did he still think there was gold there? Well, there he met the very much not dead Epinau. And Epinau and him had a good conversation. Epinau laughed in front of Dermer about how he escaped and how he had this ruse, and they had a good discourse. But Dermer was running out of time, so he couldn't finish that which he came to accomplish, whatever that was, and he headed down to Jamestown, where he stayed the winter at Martin's plantation. John Martin was a friend of John Smith, so there must have been some connection there. He wanted to come back to New England, but it was getting too close to the end of the year, so he saved it for the spring of 1620, the same year that the Pilgrims arrived. And so that spring, Thomas Dermer came back up to New England from Jamestown and had a reconnection with Squanto in Patuxet. And that's where Squanto and Tisquantum and Thomas had their last voyage together. And where did they go? To Martha's Vineyard. Why? I don't know. But there they met the very much undead Epinau yet again, the second time for Dermer, but the first time for Tisquantum. And everything went fine until at some point in time, Epinau turned on Dermer and his men, and he killed them all, except for Dermer and the man who was guarding his boat, Dermer suffering several wounds. I'll come back on why that happened. But Derma had no choice but to hot-foot it down to Martin's plantation, which he did. Getting to Martin's plantation, and then sometime in the winter of 1620-21, Thomas Derma died. Of his wounds, or of his sickness, we don't know. But we don't know where he's buried. We don't know what happened, because 1 year after that was the year of the Powhatan Uprising, and Martin's plantation was burnt down, so all records are lost. Squanto was taken prisoner by Epinal in Martha's Vineyard in probably May 1620, and he was given to the Massasoit, and he was held under house arrest until the Pilgrims accidentally arrived. And according to Somerset, Tisquantim used that time to convince the Massasoit that you're better off to making peace with the English than fighting them, given all that he had seen. That's what Somerset said. And it's kind of instructive, because when Somerset finally walked into the Pilgrims' camp in March 16th, 1621, it was only 6 days later, on the 22nd, that the Massasoit signed the peace treaty, if you will, with Governor Carver, which is more of a mutual assistance pact. It may be that the Massasoit saw the Pilgrims when he had already decided what he wanted. But in any case, Governor Bradford said of Squanto that he was an instrument from God, and he very much regretted him passing away. He died in Chatham later that year in November 1622. He's buried someplace, but we don't know exactly where. If ever you're playing golf on the Eastwood Hoe golf course, they say you're probably playing within a long driving range of where Squanto is buried. But clearly, he did his bit to help the Pilgrims. As far as Thomas Derma is concerned, he's basically written out of history. You hardly ever hear about him. But in 1622, the Council of New England basically admitted that Thomas had done more than anyone else to make peace between the Wampanoags and the English, and the Pilgrims reaped the benefit of that. True or not? But anyway, that's not exactly a Hollywood ending. But such is the nature of history, and such were the travels of the voyages of Thomas and Tisquantim. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I'd take any questions if you have them, and they're easy. Sure, sir.
What was the date of the first documented voyage of Europeans actually landing on Cape Cod?
On Cape Cod? Ah, you should have been here 2 years ago. The Vikings. No, I'm kidding. Documented. Okay, that's a good question. Landing on Cape Cod or seeing Cape Cod? Because Verrazano in 1524 would have been the first person to see Cape Cod, but he didn't stop. He kept going by. To actually set foot, I'd have to think about that a little bit. You got me. But Verrazano did go by Cap Blanc in 1524. Well, that's, okay, there you go. Gosnold, 1602. He did indeed set foot in, whether there's somebody before that, I don't know. But certainly Gosnold, you're quite right. We can say for sure that he landed in Cape Cod. Tried to set up the first colony. Yes, please.
Your research, the documents that you were able to have available to you, it seems like there were hundreds, not thousands. How did you do that?
It took a while. Ask my wife. It took a lot of sifting through, and I had to learn how to read Shakespearean English a bit, but it's amazing what's available. And I spent a lot of money on a few expensive books, and finally got myself there.
And the preservation of them is remarkable?
Is remarkable. It's many are digitized at this point in time. There are some chronologies that basically are still in book form.
We learned last week of the pirate's wife Captain Kidd's wife, and
Sarah.
Sarah, thank you. And the speaker talked of letters that are 300 years old that are only now being opened. Did you have some of that experience as well?
Yeah, and that's true. And what you find is that these documents are in odd places. The archives of Simancas in Spain, for example. We've found documents from 400 years ago. And you would think that the Hakluyt Society preserves these documents, because that's what Richard Hakluyt started doing. And you would think that, well, there's no more to be found. Well, not true. They're always unearthing something new. I like the story of Governor Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation. That was basically just his handwritten memories of the history of the Pilgrims. It was handed down through generations in the Bradford family. And then suddenly, sometime during the American Revolutionary War, they disappeared, ostensibly never to be seen again, until they were found in the library of Fulham Palace, just down the street from where I live in London. And you know, you never know. Yes, sir.
Is Tisquantim's burial at Eastward Ho? I know it's not because he likes golf, but is that myth and tradition, as you say, or is that?
So he was buried near where the ship was anchored, the Sparrow, Swallow, when it came in to trade corn with the Governor Bradford, and that would have been Jackknife Cove. Do you know Jackknife Cove? Somewhere around there. Oh, there's been lots of stories. In 1770, there was a skeleton that was washed out of the hillside. It was buried a little bit, you know the story, untraditionally. But that's basically been, debunked. No one's sure that that was actually Tisquantum. Yes, sir.
About 10 years ago, there was a new plaque made for Tisquantum, and it's in Chatham. You can go see it anytime. It's just off of main drag there, 28.
Is that this one? Okay. This was put up by the Nickerson family.
This is also done by Nickerson.
Okay.
Much more detail, it brings up to date, a lot of history on it. It's worth taking a look at it.
Then, sir, you know more than I. Yes, sir.
How old was, I know you don't have an exact date of birth, but how old was Squanto when he died, and do we know what he died from?
Okay. Well, he would have been something in the order of 37, mid-30s or so, because we don't know when he was born, having died in November-ish, 22. No, they say he died of what they said was the Indian disease. He was bleeding from the nose, and he died within 2 days.
Was that smallpox or something? The Indian disease?
No, they don't know. They don't know. In fact, the people that want to, question it, they wonder whether the Massasoit poisoned him, because he died so quickly. And there's that rumor out there as well. There's a history of poisoning as revenge, and the Massasoit did want him dead, as you know. But I would not say that that's very credible. Who's to say?
And the third part, what was the average, this is ballpark, average life expectancy in 1622?
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting question. If you take everyone that's born and you took their average life expectancy, you might very well say that the answer is 30 or 32. But that's only because so many people died before the age of 5. They skew the number down. If you got to be over 40, you could be 50, 60 years old. Sir Ferdinand the Gorgeous lived to something like 68 years old, which is a very long time. So when you have that statistic, people say, people only lived to an average age of 32. Well, that's because the mortality rate for youngsters was quite high. Yes?
There were Dermer's letters back to England during this time, and where did these sort of connections start to be made with him and his companion to the connections with home?
Where were Dermer's letters?
Yeah, like the sort of history of how these puzzle pieces came together.
Yeah, well, Dermer wrote 3 letters, and we have 1 letter. We have a partial bit of another letter. What would happen back then is you lost the letter, but someone else read it, and they quoted from it. So all you have is what they remembered of that letter and what they quoted. And so the letters themselves are lost, but the people that were allowed to read them and quote them, that lived on, if that makes sense to you.
So there's no original?
Oh, no original.
No original?
No original. Well, no. Thank you very much. Did I?